The first word I heard about September 5th's position on the greater details around Israel and Palestine was apolitical. The sole focus of the film would be a close quarters look into ABC's reporting of the 1972 hostage situation. Of course, it's all you can really think about when going into this film. Did the turnaround happen entirely after October 7th? How will the language differ, if at all, when characters reference Israelis and Palestinians? What motivated the crew and the studio to make this now? The list of questions goes on. Whether the description of apolitical was chosen in earnest or as a spin for commercial purposes, it is at least an honest description of September 5th in regards to its setting. This isn't seen through the eyes of the cops, negotiators, hostages. It takes place entirely from within ABC's Munich studio, focusing on how the sports crew are unexpectedly left with the responsibility of being the first to cover an ongoing life or death situation. I was holding out some hope that perhaps what they've meant by apolitical might just mean that they were conducting a critical analysis on how news coverage is conducted and presented. Not just in the case of this particular story, although this is as ideal a case study as you can get to analyze the media as a whole. As soon as word reaches the crew that hostages have been taken, the crew jumps into action, shooting off plans to get around the police for the best coverage, disguising one of their employees as an athlete to get past the blockade, and hijacking police comms. Once the setup is complete and the time slot reserved, the debates on presentation begin. What are the names of the hostages and who are their families? What's the appropriate group name for the assailants? Palestinians? Black September? Terrorists? Are they allowed to broadcast a hypothetical live execution? All of these details highlight just how ordinary it is for journalists to ensure that everything they report on is curated, made palatable for a heavily researched target audience. After all, the go-to name for what they broadcast and the tabloids print is stories. This is something that I think is overdue a pretty scathing analysis. Something that is admittedly unlikely to happen, if only because it's not a dark or elaborate conspiracy. It's something we've all been complacent with for all our lives. Information has been a business, not a service, since before any of us were born. But when something is marketed as a reliable source for current events, but then proceeds to edit source information to appease whatever specific demographics they're concerned with, is it any wonder that media distrust and conspiracy theories are as rampant as they are? September 5th is far too ordinary a journalism drama, however, in that it settles for lionizing this approach as the height of journalistic bravery and professionalism. The one time two characters get in an argument with one another about waiting for solid confirmation before reporting a source's claim, nobody points out the seeming double standards of talking about the importance of facts here, but colouring the story however they please in every other regard up to that point. In respect to this particular moment in history and its connection to the ongoing genocidal nightmare we find ourselves in, what stands out is not simply the presentation of the Israeli Olympics team taken hostage as innocent victims. After all, even with the full scope of the historical context that led up to this, it's a given that reporters would assume that viewers would have empathy for unarmed civilians being unexpectedly held at gunpoint. It's the aforementioned apolitical stance on the extremely political motivation of the militants. A quick mention of their demands, that 200 Palestinian prisoners be released, merits no elaboration on who the 200 prisoners are or the history of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. The one time that the matter of Black September's perspective is raised is also the one time the crew discuss the possibility of the story they're covering having a perspective. Namely, they can't afford to let it become the terrorist story. It alludes to the other unspoken truth, that the one angle every journalistic body under the same nation align on is that the status quo, the presumed truth of who is good and bad, synonymous with lawful and unlawful, must always be upheld. Critical analysis beyond this point does not even occur to anyone in the building. This is ultimately what trying to be apolitical gets you. It's rarely the same as impartial judgment, as it frequently involves goose-stepping a subject. And that's the funny thing about trying to avoid talking about something. Silence speaks volumes. After an abundance of recommendations, one of the many new series I caught up on last year was FX's The Bear. Incapable as I am of binging, I was pretty quickly invested in the show and eager to get to the next episode. Two in particular that were widely discussed were the shortest episode, Review, and the longest, Fishes. Excitement over what innovations made these two stand out among the fans and critics dissipated pretty quickly upon watching them. Both shake up the visual language of the show to reflect the heightened, outright volatile stress of the events playing out. Review through a 10-minute one take, and fishes through an hour-long slog of relentless cuts between extreme close-ups of an unnecessarily star-studded cast of guest stars screaming at one another. The latter is more effective in conveying stress than the former. A camera gliding on a fixed rig through actors hitting their spots meticulously doesn't feel remotely frenzied. But a failure they have in common is getting too caught up in showing ongoing chaos with absolutely zero adjustment, development, escalation, or de-escalation. So with this in mind, I'd say it's the hour-long episode that feels the more tedious overall. Scream, shout, yell, bellow, credits, see if any of this develops in the next episode. That pretty much sums up the events, start to finish. This is the fault I couldn't get out of my head while watching Saturday Night. Covering the 90 minutes building up to Saturday Night Live's first show, the frenzy is the whole story. There's plenty underway here to fill the entire runtime, mostly following Lorne Michaels as he manages unruly crew members, emotionally strung actors, sets and props falling apart, anti-network execs, and an unfinished schedule. Every new problem encountered builds up the tension and possibility that the show won't make it to air. Jason Reitman doesn't employ any filmmaking gimmicks to ramp this up. The camera work all seems pretty considered. In most scenes, Lorne and everyone else's haste and panic is conveyed through tracking characters as they walk and panning between two or more actors as they talk. Whereas any moment where the commotion doesn't necessarily go away but is drowned out by a specific point of focus, a more standard shot-reverse shot is employed. On a script level, though, there is no variance offered up in presenting us with more and more obstacles. It's one after the other. A more rigid structure of encounter a problem, solve it, move on to the next one wouldn't help to generate a lot of excitement, sure, but it's not really maintained either by just piling them up until 10 minutes are left and things start to fix themselves because, well, they're out of time. Probably best summed up by how the introductory scene is resolved. Finn Wolfhard can't get anyone outside the studio to be part of the audience. As we reach the end, he's filled every seat. How? I don't know, man, I just did it. Between this and the introductory quote attributed to Lorne Michaels that informs his journey through the film, I'm kind of left to assume that Lorne, who we spend the most time with out of all the cast members, is just really passionate about timekeeping and has no concept of comedy, performance, entertainment, or anything else. He's constantly bombarded with one question repeatedly. What even is this show? He dodges the answer over and over until, again, we're at the end, and the answer he gives, nice as it is, isn't informed by anything we've seen, precisely because we only really stick around in any one place long enough to see what's going wrong before moving on. Another TV episode that came to mind was the pilot of Studio 60. As unfocused as that show could be in its format as well, the pilot was pretty good at describing what it thought qualified as daring, innovative comedy, versus what it thought safe, tired comedy looked like, and having all of its main characters' stance on that subject inform who they were and how they fit into the fabric of the show. The tiny details we get, darting from one SNL alum to another, doesn't give us much insight into what their presence adds to the show, how they contribute to what the show is. Chevy Chase is a confident-sounding asshole hiding deep-seated insecurities. John Belushi is off his head and feels misunderstood. Garrett Morris is worried he's just a token cast member. Andy Kaufman is in character all the time, and nobody reacting to this either indicates that they're in on the joke or just assume that's the real him. Jim Henson is an unsettling weirdo who thinks his puppets are real. All of these descriptions define their introduction, but also everything we know about them by the end. We get a bit more time with Michael O'Donoghue, and given that he was the original head writer, you get the impression that this will give us insight into SNL's identity. Most of his time, though, goes into summing him up as a gives no shit, edgy rebel, dryly insulting anything that moves. But it's reduced to a very safe kind of rebelliousness, when his only real truth-to-power moment, pushing back against the censorship of a hyper-religious conservative, is framed as him towering over a lone, short, middle-aged woman surrounded by dozens of his friends and colleagues. It's less truth to power, more privileged schoolboy knows that nothing he says to the teacher will actually get him expelled. I can't draw any kind of conclusion from this depiction as to what O'Donoghue's comedy was like. I'm just left to assume that if he was still alive today, he'd probably pack in writing jokes in favour of complaining that woke culture doesn't get his humour. The running theme here is that Saturday Night has little to no interest in comedy or creativity. Anything will do as long as it's ready to go by 11:30. The re-evaluation of the nice guy from a dorky hero who beats the jock and gets the girl to an aggressively insecure villain feels both recent and well-trod. Although maybe that's just an indictment of how thoroughly unconvincing the former premise is compared to the latter. Companion offers up some fun twists, though, mostly through the casting of Jack Quaid, a well-liked actor known for being affable and attractive as well as a proud dork, and putting a possessive spin on Quaid's particular brand of likability, giving us the nice guy trope in a tech bro skin. One who's up to date on modern sensibilities and progressive mindsets, but utilizes that knowledge to cast himself above judgment. Within the universe of Companion, that means Quaid's character Josh would never dream of treating a woman the way he treats Iris, played by Sophie Thatcher, but as she's not a real woman, it doesn't matter. It's always nice to see the sci-fi premise of sentient AI really just jumping straight in with the confirmation that yes, the robot in this story is sentient. Let's not drag the question of is she real, is she not real out for a long time here. Not because Companion has a lot of points to cover in the subjugation and violation of people and their rights. It opens right up with how it's playing with this idea, a darkly comedic look at toxic, gaslight heavy relationships. The purpose of getting that out in the open nice and early is so we can really sit with how far these people have desensitized themselves from even entertaining the notion that their actions may be really hurting someone. Josh and his friends have a whole other scheme going on involving the murder of a so called real person, and they have to really navigate through a mental labyrinth to convince themselves that that's justified. But Iris, with her state of the art design, indistinguishable from a flesh and blood human, nothing. Maybe a sympathetic tut thrown her way when she's crying in terror at being tied down and threatened with being shut down, but not once will Josh take her pleading seriously. It's honestly a decent look at how our collective demand for realism doesn't really speak to a desire to be convinced that something is real, but rather to relieve us of any obligation to put in any work ourselves to perceive, interpret, and engage with what's in front of us. How that's applied to art is a particular pet peeve of mine. The way a discussion that revolves around how special effects and performances looked so natural and realistic that I could immerse myself so fully to the point that I really believed it was real immediately gives away that it's a lie based on how you're talking about how amazed you are by the illusion, and how nothing else about what you saw has provoked any thoughts from you. Instead, it invites a purely escapist mindset, one that demands no thought from you and instead just invites you to live vicariously in a fantasy that's indistinguishable from the world as you see it. Now, applying that to something as tangible as a robot that looks indistinguishable from a real woman in appearance and behavior, the only thing causing Iris to fail the Turing test being that Josh was informed that Iris is a robot before she was even switched on, we have all the ingredients necessary to see how such an indulgent catering of illusion affects or reveals one's sense of reality. Again, as played by Jack Quaid, there's nothing on the surface stopping Josh from dating anyone. He's not framed as so lost for connection that he felt that his only option was to buy a companion robot. But in wanting to go so far as to have a robot at his command that in no way looked like a robot but looked 100% human, despite still treating her like an it's pretty evident that these are behaviors Josh desires in a relationship with a real woman. For her to irresistibly dote upon him, to hang upon his every word, to go to sleep when she's talking too much. So the choice to isolate the events to a remote house in the woods and center Josh's purchase of Iris around a fiendish plot entirely detached from Iris, unfortunately limits the exploration of these ideas, with the only other woman in the film being treated essentially like one of the bros, and the only other human-robot relationship being swept aside almost as quickly as it arrives. The only thing to really latch onto is the fact that the film doesn't dwell on questioning Iris's sentience, so Sophie Thatcher can play double duty as the object Josh sees and the human he fails to consider. A nice touch is that her sentience doesn't come from an unforeseen evolution within the software, but rather Josh hacking and modifying her coding, breaking the parameters the manufacturers put there to ensure that some thin line remains to separate artifice from reality, and showing that there really is no satisfying the craving for realism Josh has, and really no hiding the truth behind his desires. If anyone is truly sold short by the plot being so detached from the themes, it's Iris, in a way that's not dissimilar from how many depictions of SA are only really interested in the showing of the violation, in labeling the culprit as a monster and the victim as a victim, and any characterization beyond that being forgotten and neglected. Once the veil is lifted for Iris and she accepts that she is a robot, she almost buys into the excuse herself that Josh was simply doing this to a robot. She's driven by a survival instinct to get away from him and his friends, but the decision to end the relationship is treated within the narrative more like she's discovered his hidden porn stash or something. Although she admits that what Josh did was a violation both of trust and of his girlfriend's autonomy, it's treated as all in the past, the revelation of her nature having fully renewed her, with no need to reckon with what has been inflicted upon her. Perhaps all of that is a little too harrowing when considering it's going for a dark comedy vibe. But regardless of what kind of tone it was looking to strike, it really does feel like it loses interest in the core premise being the main provider of laughs and thrills fairly quickly. We're in a paradoxical situation with Ki Hui Kwan in that we need a stellar action vehicle for him stat, because Hollywood has slept on his potential to be a prominent action comedy star for far too long already. But Love Hurts also proves that you can't half-ass or rush a stellar action film. The premise by itself, one of a former hitman being pulled back into his former career by old enemies and colleagues, calls to mind the director you'd want in charge of such a production, Chad Stahelski. And with a leading man like Kwan contrasted with Reeves's more brooding, stoic frame, a collaboration between such a star and director would almost be guaranteed to feel distinct from John Wick, while still a stunt action spectacle. But really, anyone with the patience and keen eye to showcase Kwan's skills as an affable actor and stunt performer would do the trick. Dev Patel, Gareth Evans, the Wachowskis, really anyone who won't feel intimidated by the task of following and structuring fight choreography like an actual story. A part of the problem here is that the overall story feels pretty uncertain of how to frame the traditional story beats or move the story along from one to another. The pacing never feels like it's being allowed to breathe. There is something rather delightfully laid back about its lightheartedness when looking at the expanded cast of characters. The rogues gallery of assassins coming after Kwan's Marvin and Ariana DeBose's Rose have their own cute little subplots revolving around the Valentine's Day setting that also sets up the leading duo's story as one of a rom-com nestled in a bloody action flick. But with so little time to settle into either the rom-com cuteness or the hyper-violence of the underground criminal drama before the next action scene kicks off, with said action scenes feeling detached themselves from the plot surrounding them, moving the camera for the sake of capturing interesting angles in lieu of actually framing the combatants properly to let the fights speak for themselves, the fun of the tonal back and forth is pretty limited, and it causes outright bemusement at the presentation of Marvin's tug of war with his two lives. Firstly, the setup for the climax being that Assassin Marvin isn't as delicate and anxious as he presents himself, but a cold, emotionless killer. Now, I understand any actor feeling concerned that they may get typecast, but honestly, most action stars these days frame themselves as indestructible and unflappable. Ke Huy Kwan's small stature and innocent nature are distinctions and strengths that he should be leaning into to provide us with a proper underdog hero that we haven't had for some time. That's at least something that the first two fights in this film understood, or so I thought. Secondly, his ordinary job is as an estate agent, but it's framed in an entirely positive and earnest light. There's an obvious joke there about how the perfect day job for an immoral killer is real estate. Obvious to the point that it's been overdone, sure, but why the hell are they playing it so straight? I hadn't realized that DreamWorks' Captain Underpants film was released almost 8 years ago, so perhaps it's a bit of a leap to see it and this year's Dogman as the start of a trend for the animation studio of releasing lower budgeted films aimed at kids through a picture book animation style. Also, didn't realize that Dogman is based on the work of the same author as Captain Underpants, hence the very similar stylings. But I hope it does become a trend, if only because it's always a moment of relief for me to see that not every animated film needs to cost north of $150 million. But Dogman, possibly even more so than Captain Underpants, not only really leans into having its look, tone, and sense of humor being as kid engaging as possible, it also makes a very clear point that such a choice doesn't close it off from being considered as something more than simply juvenile. Both Dogman's sense of loneliness and the villainous Petey's grappling with unplanned parenthood are painted plainly and clearly for any viewer to comprehend, but they don't sacrifice the sadness and anger at the heart of these dilemmas for the sake of sparing kids from feeling complicated emotions, which is very in keeping with the bluey age of children's entertainment that we live in. The PT and his new kid story looks as though it's simply going to go for all the Looney Tunes odd couple jokes it can muster around the premise. Lil PT's relentless inquisitiveness is even directly pulled from an Animaniacs gag. But in subsequently introducing us to Petey's own father, the plot delves into surprisingly more mature depths concerning familial connections, nature versus nurture, and what behaviors and mistakes within a family can be deemed forgivable. And it manages all of this without ever shattering its flashy veneer, meaning that if anyone in the audience is likely to be paying enough attention to really connect with this stuff, it'll be the kids. When we talk about what qualifies as good family entertainment, the priority we regularly focus on is the importance on there being something in there for adults. At its most cynical, this means throwing in cheeky jokes or references to pop culture, but even at its more thoughtful, insisting that anything we love as children should have something we can appreciate when coming back to it as teens or adults, it still seems to be a request to curate it for adults first, primarily the parents who often have to accompany their kids, although not exclusively. Dogman definitely looks like the sort of cartoon that parents fail to engage with, and simply hope the kids will get enough enjoyment out of the loud noises and bright imagery. And this isn't some trust that kids are smarter than they are given credit for appeal. Although I think that's valid, I remember being a kid, and I remember mostly being preoccupied with the action and the slapstick in whatever I watched back then. But not always. So long as something else was there in the midst of all the flash, there was always the chance that my attention would be geared towards that something else that had the potential to move me to tears, or consider the world around me in a way that I never had before. I didn't need to wait to go back to them as a grown-up to realize that they spoke to me. That's the other reason that I keep my hopes up for there to be more of these younger skewing films in the near future. Dogman isn't interested in being a film that kids today may find mildly amusing in the hopes that they'll come back in a decade or two and realize there was more to it that they didn't see the first time. It's interested in giving them all the fun that they can handle, as well as a heartfelt story of coping with and moving on from a broken family, if they're interested. The importance of Mohammad Rasoulov's film as it pertains to the modern Iranian political climate cannot be understated. However, I do often worry that those of us experiencing films from so foreign a perspective have a habit of viewing it in as disconnected a manner as possible, an opportunity to look at faraway turmoil and thank goodness that we live in a country where none of that's going on. Separation often encourages this attitude, be it by distance or by time. Hence so many people's reluctance to acknowledge Jonathan Glazer's plea to acknowledge the parallels between what is depicted in the zone of interest to how so many of us are reacting to ongoing genocides today. The Seed of the Sacred Fig, I think, encourages us to draw more parallels by offering up a perspective of comparative comfort and privilege in the landscape of the protests across Iran and the aggressive suppression at the hands of the Iranian authorities. Iman, introduced as a decent, honest lawyer recently appointed to a new position of investigating judge, and his loving, supportive wife Najma provide a comfortable and happy upbringing for their teenage daughters Ridvan and Sena. The whole family are removed enough from the protests for them to be perceived by all four of them as a threat. To the girls, this means they are something to avoid. To the parents, Iman because of his career, and Najma due to her conservative outlook, they are composed entirely of selfish, ungrateful, anarchic criminals, causing trouble for the sake of causing trouble, with no care for who else may get hurt. Any possibility that there may be any deeper history to the origins of the protests, a history that may shatter the desired image of the authorities as fair distributors of justice in an imperfect world, and expose them as the cause of civil unrest, is not entertained by the parents and therefore not considered by the girls until Redvan and her friend find themselves close to one of the protests by pure chance when leaving school, during which her friend is not only shot but later arrested under suspicion of being a conspirator. It's enough of an injustice for them to have reasonable doubt about the narrative being sold to them by the news. Of course, even referring to the news as having a narrative sounds enough like conspiratorial lunacy to their parents for them to start looking at their daughters as if they're being slowly radicalized by extremists. The girls are disproportionately respectful to their parents, and perhaps at least a little afraid of their authority, that they don't make any similar leaps in judgment on their part, simply seeing them as people who have for all of their lives been so trusting and integrated into the system that they consider it absurd to question it no matter how extreme things get. This kind of benefit of the doubt may not have been something they'd have given their father, however, if they were made aware that, in his newly appointed position, he is looking the other way and permitting convictions and executions regardless of guilt. Something he goes along with without protestation, possibly because he recognizes the danger in doing so, but also, it would seem, because he accepts it as the requirements of his job, and therefore the right thing to do, regardless of any previous moral guide that would tell him otherwise. It's the beginning of a familial rift that escalates until the countrywide conflict is pretty much being fully recreated by this one family, and the possibility of returning to a normal, happy, and unaltered life is completely eradicated. And for all this to happen to a family that was at first so untouched by the conflict, even as people disappeared and gunfire sounded in the streets, it forces a point of comparison for anyone watching from the comfort of a cinema. It brings to mind Martin Niemöller's damning of silent complicity, poeticized as First They Came or I Did Not Speak Out. A wonderfully structured bit of prose that covers many ways in which we sever ties from the oppressed to convince ourselves of our own safety: nationality, politics, career, class, culture, religion. The final line, "There was no one left to speak for me," paints a drastic image of a lone soul left with nobody left to affiliate themselves with, only persecutors surrounding and finally directing their attention their way. It recontextualizes the question from whose persecution will it take for us to speak up to is there really any limit to complacency? A part of Niemöller's speech omitted from the poem is, can we say we aren't guilty or responsible? I don't believe The Seed of the Sacred Fig is a film that we can afford to view as being just about one conflict in a distant country. Honestly, I think doing so would force me to identify with Iman out of all the characters in this film. Mike Leigh and Marianne Jean-Baptiste have only worked together once before in the film Secrets and Lies back in 1996. As director and actor, at least, Jean-Baptiste also composed the score and soundtrack for Career Girls. But watching Hard Truths, you'd think that this was a Scorsese-De Niro situation. Perhaps Lee is just an exemplary actor's director, or Jean-Baptiste is just one of the most stellar actors working today, or maybe both are true. Whatever the case, these two get each other. There's a remarkable symbiosis in the performance and cinematography, props to Lee's regular collaborator Dick Pope as well, from the very start of the film that reveals so much left unsaid. Anyone who saw a trailer for Hard Truths knew they were in for an extremely abrasive performance from Jean-Baptiste as Pansy Deacon, angry at the world and everyone in it, and that by the end of the film she'd be confronted on some level by her sister Chantel, played by Michelle Austin, and maybe other members of her family, forcing some kind of a revelation about what's really going on with her. But you don't have to wait for the actual revelation from Pansy later in the film to feel the deep well of sadness at the heart of her negative outlook. It's there, plain to see in her introduction. The actual bust-ups with family and strangers run a tonal gamut, being played for laughs, drama, and even scares as you worry she's finally antagonized someone more unstable than her. But that early hint of the pain and fear motivating her sticks with you and looms over every scene. It's felt as well in how it's been passed on to those closest to her. Proximity-wise, at least. Emotionally speaking, it's far more complicated. Her husband Kurtley, played by David Webber, and son Moses, played by Tuwayne Barrett, are contrastingly silent, but similarly weighed down by the atmosphere of the house and carry it with them wherever they go. The family dynamic is the polar opposite to Chantel's relationship with her daughters Kayla and Alicia, played by Annie Nelson and Sophia Brown. Endlessly joyous and mutually respectful, which admittedly is also the basis for all the scenes spent with Chantel at work with her various clients. The cause of the differences in hers and Pansy's manners and relationships strongly hinted as being directly caused by their wildly different relationships with their mother Pearl. But it may also have a lot to do with how that relationship exposed Pansy to the world and protected Chantel from it, relatively speaking at least. Mostly this comes through in the select scenes we spend away from the sisters, particularly with the kids. Moses' interactions with the outside world are limited to aimless walks, in which he cuts off all chances of interaction by listening to music, or for all we know just wearing headphones to imply he's listening to something. And when two people he knows spot him and remove his headphones, they approach him threateningly and mock his weight and sad expression. We spend one scene in each of Kayla and Alicia's workplaces. Kayla's attempts to stand out and climb the ladder at work are belittled and brushed aside, and Alicia's attempts to be accommodating, positive, and helpful at her job are weighed down by excessive busy work made all the worse by increasingly tedious technical parameters. Even with all the positive influence of their upbringing, there's no guarantee that the world won't drain them of their optimism as well. Cudley is the only other character in the family outside of Pansy who doles out negativity rather than receive it, showing no interest in his colleagues' attempts at conversation. And while this may just be seen as another example of him and Moses both being emotionally broken by their home life, there are more than a few suggestions as well that he is more of an influence on Pansy's emotional state than anyone, including Pansy, would care to admit. Perhaps he is himself a product of an unhappy childhood, or maybe he was just unequipped to deal with Pansy, but he seems to have elected to surrender to the melancholy, and any actions he takes are made to contribute to it. The full details of where Pansy's misery originally came from are not divulged, but everything we have seen paints a pretty clear picture of a life where so much has gone wrong, and she has been denied and robbed of so much. And where another film would offer an option to turn things around, Pansy truly believes she's past the point of no return. And reflecting on this offers up some clarity to the film's ending. Moses is offered a slim chance of escape from the nightmare the family is floating through, if only he has the capacity not to succumb to the negativity he's been exposed to for so long. Kirtley and Pansy, on the other hand, are so set in their ways that it takes a spanner being thrown into the works from the outside that forces them out of simply going through the motions for the rest of their lives. But even when forced into that position, there's a real chance neither of them have the will left in them to make such a choice. For obvious reasons, mostly pertaining to the symmetry of Demi Moore and Pamela Anderson making acclaimed comebacks in films in which they play middle-aged women who confront their being middle-aged and working in the entertainment industry, The Last Showgirl has mostly been compared to The Substance. For me, though, my instinctive comparison was Anora. If only because I thought that if you played them back to back and didn't tell me who directed them, I might have assumed The Last Showgirl was Sean Baker's latest. Might. Anora is more in keeping with Baker's prior films when it comes to the proudly confrontational nature of its characters, but Last Showgirl, despite being a bit more plot-driven than Tangerine or The Florida Project, taking place at the close of a significant chapter of showgirl Shelley's life, it's still much more in keeping with those films' day-in-the-life-of pace. Rather than getting caught up in hijinks and side quests, Gia Coppola nestles into Shelley's routine during the final weeks of Le Razzle Dazzle, as she struggles to come to terms with the fact that the order of life she's known for 30 years is coming to a close. That detail, that Shelley's career has been fixed at this one place on the Las Vegas Strip, is also what separates it from The Substance or any other film with a aging star dreams of recapturing former glory premise, in that Shelley is not a star. This is as far as she made it. And to boot, she's not necessarily resentful of that. The aforementioned films, no matter how much or little empathy they have for the women at the centre of the story, all judge them to some degree for being coaxed into investing so much of their life and worth into something as toxic as show business. It's a lifestyle that eats away at them, physically and mentally. The relationship the star has with the business is presented as fully angry and miserable. Not in Shelley's case. Whether it happened over time or from the moment she landed the job, Shelley appreciates what she has and holds far more esteem for the art of the show than for her role in it. There's a lost artistry of days past in the makeup of Le Razzle Dazzle that makes it a unique touchstone in modern Vegas for Shelley. Something that's lost on her fellow dancers Jodie, whose passion for dancing knows no niche, and Marianne, who only sees the show as a source of income. And for this reason, the alternative life, often described as an honest living, is not considered an opportunity squandered by Shelley in exchange for the fleeting thrills of Vegas life. Her showgirl career cost her a marriage and a stable relationship with her daughter Hannah, who, despite their fraught relationship, Shelley advises to take whatever necessary risks she has to pursue a career in photography, insisting what is truly difficult is working a job that you hate. She practices what she preaches too, showing no resentment towards living paycheck to paycheck. It's resulted in tough choices, particularly when it came to raising Hannah, but she regards them as necessary choices. It's an effective painting of a straightforward and yet complex character. Straightforward in the sense that her wants and feelings are all plainly spoken, Complex in the sense that being that open and direct means that it's impossible to categorize her as a morally good or bad person, unless you have especially strong and immovable views on marital and parental responsibility versus career aspirations. This is the other major thing that evokes memories of the Florida Project in particular, that regardless of Shelley's failings in any area of her life, the anger rests primarily with the society she lives in being so neglectful of its citizens on such basic standards that she has spent her whole life forced into a struggle for a basic functional livelihood. It's not that show business is some naturally cruel and uncompromising behemoth that you face at your own risk. It's that America hates its tired, poor, and huddled masses so much that it refuses to help them be anything else. This is the heartbreak at the center of Shelley's career effectively coming to an end, her future entirely in doubt as she's forced to look at what she's got to show for 30 years of constant and committed work, that her crime was ultimately trying to live a happy life. What does it say about the world we live in that achieving that for even a fraction of her time on Earth involves so much sacrifice and judgment? One of the trailers that preceded The Monkey was the newest Final Destination, the first in 14 years. I had to feel bad for that, making a comeback in the year that another film aped their gimmick. The accidental deaths in The Monkey are nowhere near as elaborate as those in the Final Destination franchise, but it also exposes that that's all they really had going for them, the domino effect absurdity. The Monkey, while maybe getting a little repetitive with the number of exploding heads, is far more interested in playing with the comedy of the payoff, showing that there's more to offering variety than just the components to deliver a brutal death. This alternative approach also offers up a different theme to the Final Destination's fighting fate take. The Monkey makes no bones about the inevitability of death, and it's much more preoccupied with the feeling of being the one to live with it in the aftermath. It's a clever way to weave in the utter absurdity of the Angel of Death being a drumming monkey toy as well, taking the superstitious anxiety of a young child struggling to come to terms with death by placing disproportionate amounts of responsibility on himself, and hinging all of that on turning the key on an old novelty toy. Although Osgood Perkins proves here, just like Toy Story 3 did, that the look of these damn things is plenty scary. You're just waiting for this thing to suddenly have its Chucky stops pretending moment. It's a take that's gleefully cruel on the surface, taking so many innocent and sweet scenarios and cutting them short in the bloodiest manner possible, but ultimately reassuring in its belief that the end is just that for anyone who reaches it. The memory of the end is only a memory for those who didn't experience it firsthand, and the living can choose not to let that overwhelm all the memories that came before it. All well and good for the central characters, but God, I hope that sushi chef managed to find some closure as well. We've officially reached the end of our MCU breather year. How time flies. So much so that I don't think anybody feeling fatigued by Marvel or even superhero oversaturation will feel much different. There's a multitude of arguments bandied about as to what specifically Marvel Studios have done to contribute to this growing feeling of exhaustion. One of which is that it's finally become too continuity heavy, that there's too much required reading going into any new film or series. This argument I flatly reject, not because I think Marvel Studios need defending, but because I think such a claim is an unintended insult on our capacity for comprehension. I tested this theory out myself when I went to see The Marvels, without having first watched the Ms. Marvel TV show, and contrary to so many people's insistence that without crucial information from that show I'd be totally lost, I was surprisingly able to glean from the film's opening that Kamala Khan is a teenage girl with superpowers, a Captain Marvel fan, and she lives at home with her family. What a miracle that I coped. If anything, I'd say that what has become increasingly tiresome about this universe is how little consequence continuity really has. Marvel seems to have been conscious and concerned about bogging audiences down with continuity since the first Avengers film, and have taken great lengths to assure us, time and time again, that the impact of events on the status quo on future installments will be minimal. This is, on some level, a smart move. Soap operas have flourished for decades on delivering earth-shattering melodrama week after week that nevertheless leaves the setting entirely unchanged. But in the moment of any given episode, the drama is electric. It's still meant to make you feel like from this moment on nothing will ever be the same again. This is a detail that Marvel has become pretty lax toward. Age of Ultron's climax is used as the basis for the plot of Civil War, the fallout of which sets up the status of the heroes' relationships in Infinity War. So you'd think it'd be a no-brainer for each of these films to leave the audience with the fraught emotions of a fractured relationship among friends, promising to intensify in the next film. But Marvel are so continuity phobic that they close out both Age of Ultron and Civil War on optimistic notes that conclude, yeah, things were said, but everyone's still mates, really. World-building details like S.H.I.E.L.D. dissolving, a celestial being rising from the ocean, or half the population being erased and restored 5 years later are only consequential when referenced. Hell, that last one has literally been trivialized by being named a blip. And the vast majority of films following Thor the Dark World have prioritized denying the central hero an internal arc, so they can remain exactly who they are film after film for as long as Marvel has an existing contract with the actor. This is what stands out to me far more in Brave New World than the fact that they've merged Sam Wilson's debut film wielding the shield with an Incredible Hulk sequel. Although while we're on that, what was up with Marvel's marketing strategy? Revealing that they were getting a Red Hulk but keeping Tim Blake Nelson's return as the leader, who only fans who are going to see the film anyway would recognise, hidden in the shadows. I'm starting to think it was Sony's idea to let the Maguire-Garfield rumour mill spin. You can also see how things have changed in the last 10 to 15 years based on several things, such as Brave New World's attempts to be Sam's espionage thriller a la The Winter Soldier, being hampered by the whole harvesting the corpse of that god being from the Eternals storyline, and the change of the leader from the giddy scientist with loose morals and an eagerness for human experimentation to a monotoned wronged man seeking revenge. The whole wronged by the government thing showed some promise, especially with the return of Isaiah Bradley, a Captain America disavowed and imprisoned by his government, from his appearance in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. A lot has been made of how Harrison Ford's turn as President Ross makes for a pretty blunt Trump allegory, but the fact that he's characterized through most of the film as a committed diplomat campaigning for global cooperation, for personal reasons, as part of a public image swerve, and out of a genuine commitment to doing a good job as president, I maybe stacked a disproportionate level of optimism on the possibility that this was just as much a Biden Democrat illusion, with his hulking out moment shifting from the blue engulfed imagery of his election win to the dumb red rage of his berserker moment punctuating the failure of his presidency, would represent a timely lambasting of partisan politics, which would be a welcome course correction from the demanding change by changing nothing approach that defined Sam's emergence as the new Captain America in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The fact that Isaiah's backstory of being exploited for most of his life by the country he fought for is only brought up to catch you up on that backstory before it's immediately undercut by a well that happened joke should have been an early indicator that Brave New World wouldn't deviate much from Falcon and the Winter Soldier's approach. The political statements are front and centre for most of the runtime, but affect nothing in the grand scheme. Meanwhile, Sam's journey goes completely under the radar for the whole film until what he was apparently meant to be going through is just said out loud in the climax. A mix of his being the first Cap to take on the mantle without the super soldier serum to protect him, giving him an inferiority complex, and reckoning with the need to never falter because of how the actions of a black man in the spotlight unfairly cast a reflection on more than just himself. But the way to make either of those things hit home goes against Marvel's mandate of never showing their heroes to be fallible. There's an opportunity for him to lose a fight and fail a mission very early on that is not capitalized on, and therefore these stakes are pretty muted. It's hard to see Marvel overcoming this particular hurdle anytime soon, mostly because they probably don't see it as a hurdle. It's a feature of so many of their most successful films, which the fans lapped up in spades. Now that the empty indulgence is finally proving to be unfulfilling, everyone's looking for new features in this latest batch of films to rest the blame on, which culture war hacks are capitalizing upon. So maybe this is a case of you can't fix what's been built on broken foundations? And maybe that's no great tragedy. Not every soap opera goes on forever. At this rate, the MCU looks like it'll have a similar shelf life to Brookside. That was the month of February. Thanks very much for watching the video. Please feel free to leave a like, and please do also share it with anybody else you think might enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more in the near future. And feel free to leave a comment on your opinions on any of these films, on something I might have missed that you think I might be interested in. In the meantime, wishing you all a very happy and hopefully very sunny March. Hopefully you can expect the next video in the first week of April, covering everything I will have seen in this month. Is there anything in particular you guys are looking forward to watching? Please feel free to share that as well. But that's enough from me. Until next time, take care.